Welcome to Khanversations. I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan, and today we have with us Professor Jacqueline Ann Braveboy-Wagner, who is a senior professor and distinguished scholar of the Global South at City University of New York. She's originally from the Caribbean, and she has worked for decades on the politics of Global South. But before we start talking to her, if you're coming to Khanversations for the first time, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and do plan to share this video with your friends, colleagues, and students. I also want those of you who are in Chicago, who are watching this show, to know that I will be arriving in Chicago the next weekend on October 22nd. I will be giving the Sir Syed Ahmed Khan lecture in Chicago. Hope to see some of you then. So now, without much ado, let's turn and welcome to Khanversation Professor Braveboy-Wagner.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. Very pleased to be here. Right. And hopefully we'll have a nice conversation, nice, relaxed conversation.
We will.
If you want me to go into talking about the Global South a little bit, I would say right away that there is contention about the term.
Sure,
All
sure.
right. When I first began talking, and I pride myself, I guess I never really thought about it, but on people have argued that I'm one of the first to have mentioned Global South in the title of a book on international affairs like this. And the since then we've had a bit of a sort of a little bit of outpouring, right, of work on the Global South, or using the term the Global South. And of course, as things develop, there is always going to be contention. So I maintain, and I always make it pretty clear, I maintain the approach to the Global South, which is very territorial. And many people do not like territorial approaches these days. It is territorial in the sense that I see it as a successor to the Third World. And if you follow the UN documentation, which I follow a lot, the UN started to use the term as successor to what used to be the Third World, meaning the African and Asian and Latin American and Caribbean states, primarily states which had been colonized. If they had not been fully colonized, they would have been quasi-colonized, or, the way Thailand or Saudi Arabia, have been. And those are the states which we used to call the Third World. We used to also have a Fourth World, but the Fourth World was the poorest of the Third World. And so those are the states that I am particularly interested in, the regions of the world that I'm interested in. Why I mentioned some contention is that there are movements that would take the territory out of it, and maybe just look at the whole question of decoloniality, or just look at the ways in which there are southern elements within the North, let's say immigrants, right, and so on within the North. It's a more sociological approach and a more philosophical approach. The Europeans have been taking that approach, which would be looking at everybody on the margins, so to speak, or identity, certain identity issues, etc. But I think that expands it a little bit too much in terms of the things that I would like the focus to be on. So I don't want to, I recognize it. I recognize that there's something that some people are using these days called the Global South with an S, right?
Yeah.
To indicate, Global South can be sort of anywhere where you have oppression. I certainly recognize, but since I have a little bit of indigenous blood, that the indigenous, people, etc., those have to be studied, and have to be studied in similar ways in terms of their the ways in which they have been treated. But I would like continually to focus on Africa, on Asia, on Latin America, and on the countries that were formerly colonized, because I believe that they share, certain approaches in international affairs.
I think sometimes in being politically correct in international relations, we have lost some theoretical rigor. So, for
Yes.
example, people are saying, well, we don't want to use the word underdeveloped world or world, which is not, or developing world even. So we
Right.
want to use
Right.
the terms like emerging markets or to talk about the global south. See,
Yeah.
some of the characteristics, I mean, you could look at suburbs and you could look at inner cities in America and argue that
Mhm.
you can see the first world and the third world right here in this one
Absolutely.
city.
Absolutely.
But before I go further on this question, I want to thank you for contributing an excellent chapter in my recent book on values and foreign policy. And you
Was
talked
a
about the
pleasure.
liberal order and global south. See, when we talk, I also teach a class called the politics of developing nations. And
Mhm.
sometimes it is so difficult because I find students getting confused. And one of my students says, Professor Khan, can you tell me the difference between G77 and the third world and the developing world
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
on top of the global south? And
Mhm.
tell me, is China part of the global south or not? And I thought it was one of the smartest questions I got, and I was
Yeah.
wondering, I'll toss it to you.
Yeah, I mean, there. Let's face it, right? We this is nomenclature. We call things names, but there's always a little bit of confusion on the margins and on the edges, right? And by the way, I do agree with you that there's a third will in the north and so
Sure.
forth. I just don't want to study it by itself. um, I agree, and I know students are often confused. I think when it comes to for example, I wrote a little book called "Institutions of the Global South," and I'm doing the second edition right now. And there, what I tried to show was some of the differences in these kinds of organizations, right? In the global south, right? If we just take it as the African, the Asian, Latin America, formerly colonized countries, which also happen to have experienced as a result of colonialism uh, a certain type of economic structure, right? Which has led to underdevelopment in many cases. And so if we look at that, right, and we take that as our base, what we do is then we look at the different institutions which have been developed by these countries. The G77 is what I count and I admire as what I call a tricontinental organization. It is able to move. Its composition is across continents. The non-aligned movement across continents, but then you have in each region, right, different institutions and so on. And so I think that the students must realize there's a hierarchy, right, of organizations, and that you don't just say, okay, the G77 is the, is the global south, but a lot depends on what you're talking about. The G77 is primarily a socioeconomic, primarily economic, really, right, grouping. The non-aligned movement, more political, even though they relate to each other, and so you can divide it right into different types of organizations and so on. But what it shows is just the very richness, right, of what we call the global south. There's a richness there. This is what I am absolutely charmed, right, by what goes on in the global south, right? And so but I understand the confusion in terms of China. I wrote, initially way back when, right? I wrote a book called Interpreting the Third World. And in that book, I said, I'm leaving China out. I don't consider China to be third world because at the time, right, it was a nuclear, or beginning to nuclearize. It was a member of the security. It is still right, a veto member of the Security Council, etc. And I felt that it wasn't quite right, third world.
It has the perks of the northern states.
Exactly. And now it's developed even more, right? So it's pretty advanced. And so I find it hard to just say it's global south, but at the same time, it situates itself. You do have to go by how countries perceive themselves, and it situates itself in the global south. It works to. In fact, I'm just reading a contribution to the second edition of this diplomatic book by James Chaw, and it's clear we're pointing out that without the global south today, China's rise may not be quite as as
Right.
spectacular
Yeah.
as it thinks. So it's become even more important to associate China with the global South. So I have developed a way of just of calling it global South plus, right? So I say China is global South plus.
Yeah.
Okay, Turkey may be global South, although Turkey has not actually ever said that it's global South. It just says the diplomats say we prefer not to have any, any kind of label, right? We work with the global South, but Turkey what has a history of imperialism,
Yeah.
okay, of European imperialism, really. And so I hesitate to call it global South, but I would put it in global South plus, category.
I mean, by bringing up Turkey, you remind me of another cluster of nations called BRICS. So
Mhm.
you see BRICS as those set of countries who are trying to basically escape the global south and become
Yes.
part of the global north. Others, and how do you see BRICS?
I don't think BRICS want to escape. I hope they don't. Right? I mean, why would you want to escape again such a lovely grouping of countries, many of whom are rising and many of whom you can help, right? To improve their economic situation. I am not one who believes they want to be global north. All right, Brazil, and I'm leaving Russia out, right? Brazil, India, China. I believe that they maintain a link, right, with the global south. So it's many of us, you may have started in poverty and then you rise up and then you forget all about helping, those. I don't believe that that's what I believe that these countries have a foundation in the south, all right, and consider themselves leaders of the south. The whole history, right, of since independence, since the Afro-Asian movement and so on, has been that they want to be leaders. And who they want to be leaders of, they want to be leaders of this vast number of countries in there. So I think what they want to do is actually acquire a space, an equal space, right, with the global north countries in the world, in the international structure, in international institutions, in terms of influence, etc. But I don't think that means they want to be global north.
You know,
They don't want to abandon Western, to become Western, or become, I mean, what are we talking about even when we talk about becoming global north? I'm not even sure, right?
yes, that is true. And you see, sometimes when we teach, when we go through theories of development and you talk about modernization, then we talk about the Weberian distinction between the developed and the underdeveloped, and we talk about countries which are not modern,
Mhm.
which are traditional, but we identify certain characteristics. They are post-colonial in the sense that they were colonized.
Right.
They are poorer. They are also probably undemocratic. So, do you buy into these
No,
commonalities that are associated with the global South?
no.
Or what do you think are the common outstanding traits of the global South countries?
I of course reject. I reject it wouldn't surprise you. Reject modernization theory, right? And
Yeah.
rejected it for decades because it assumes that you move from tradition to modernity and you move it, in an ethnocentric way, and that is not true. Countries can choose different ways in which to progress and so on, right? So I do object to that, and I object to these dichotomies. You're either this or that. You're either, and so on. And what I see in the countries that I study is a fluidity. All right. They may not be this, they may not be that. They may not be fully democratic by Western standards, but they're as democratic as they, can be right now, given the circumstances and so on and so forth. So I see a lot more fluidity and a lot more nuance than the theories. I'd say some of those comparative politics theories were developed primarily by Western people who, they went in, they analyzed things, and they said this to that and this to that, right, etc. But those kind of categories always put the Europe and the United States as the ones to emulate.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a problem, especially today, if you have an alternative like China, right, and so on. China does not want to be, to be the West, right? Just doesn't want to be. So then, what are you going to do if where you're going to place China, etc.? Is it modern? Is it not? Is it, So you're going to have. To me, I don't look at categories that way. Okay, I simply look, and now I know, for example, that democracy. You mentioned democracy, and democracy tends to be the big thing, and one of the reasons why people moved away from the third world, the idea of the third world was it was so pejorative. The idea that, first of all, that you're third, right? You're not first, second, you're somehow third. And then also that you're undemocratic, you're corrupt, you are, this and that, as if there could never be any shining examples, right? Now, I myself would admit that, of course, many countries in these parts of the world are undemocratic and corrupt and this and that and yeah. So I would never. I really don't. I've encountered some people who don't want to see the bad. The
Good.
living. I'll tell you. I once when I met. I think it was Johann Galtung for the first time, and he was a well-known peace
Sure.
researcher and so on. And after he talked, I said to him, "But you really, it's not true that that the poverty in the third world is something to to sort of leave alone, right, or whatever." I said, you need to help, right? You need these countries to improve, all right, and to move ahead. And he said, "I'm sorry for you." He said he
Oh,
was sorry.
well, he
Yeah,
was
because I
also
did.
he was probably the first one to talk about the South in the North, right? And the North
I
in the South.
I loved his work. So so I was quite devastated when he said, "I'm sorry for you that you cannot see." But I said, it's a sort of romanticism that, like the noble savage or something. So you're romanticizing poverty and all that, right? And that is not good. Everybody wants to come out, emerge from poverty and have the electricity and water and and whatever supplies, etc., etc. So I think he was confusing two things. One, which is, yes, maybe the West should not interfere, as much, or bring its model and pretend that it's working for these people, or something. Maybe you shouldn't do that, right? But at the same time, there have to be uh, in ways in which local and outside can work together to improve, right, these countries, especially since many of these countries have gotten that way because of colonial practices,
I
you
agree.
see.
Yeah. So, in the past, say in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even,
Mhm,
one
mhm,
of the complaints was that post-colonial countries were so closely tied to their former colonial empires and colonizers that there was very little scope for South-South trade, South-South
mhm.
cooperation,
Absolutely.
and South-South engagement and dialogue.
Yes, yes.
But now, as some of the southern countries are becoming a bit more prosperous and are
Mhm.
allocating research, we see a South-South dialogue and we see some beginnings of
Yes.
South-South. So China's this Belt and Road Initiative, which is
Mhm.
seen as an attempt as a counter-hegemonic move by China.
Yes,
Do
yes.
you also see that is it possible that the Belt and Road Initiative unintentionally might actually end up integrating the global South?
Yes, I should first say that this South-South collaboration is new, right? It's, as you mentioned, since I think 1979, it was put forward by the developing countries as a way forward. Instead of having to totally depend on the northern countries and on these partners, you could now work across continents, develop new linkages and so on, right? So I could trade with Brazil, I can trade, with Africa and so on and so forth, and etc. So it was something which was really, really pushed by the United Nations. But you're right, it hasn't been as effective as today, right? Because today the key has been the world changing enough to allow these countries like China, to become strong enough. Because before they could talk about it, and you could try to give each other aid, etc., but you weren't strong enough to really do things effectively. Belt and Road. So this is all by the way of saying that I'm not surprised that China would come up with something like this, right? With something that is on a scale that can compare, right, with what the OECD, and these countries do. Um, and I think that it has been a very, very effective program in terms of getting people on board. At first, it was just Asia and so on, but now Latin America and others have joined. Trinidad, by the way, was the first in the Caribbean to join in the
Sure.
BRICS. Um, and so I think it is something that I would give China big props for. Never mind that it is not necessarily what people think, meaning, oh, it's just altruistic.
No, it's
It isn't just altruistic. It helps China. I mean, nothing. You wouldn't expect any country to just give away, aid and so on and so forth. There are terms, I think. But yeah, it is to me a good example of South-South cooperation, which are pushing right South-South cooperation because of the norms, right? The norms of South-South cooperation, which give agency to the countries that you're giving assistance to. In other words, you're going to always ask them, right? What do they want? How do they want to do this? You're not going to pressure them in a hegemonic way that they must have certain standards or else, right? And so on.
but
Um,
Professor Braveboy-Wagner, if you look
mhm,
at this discussion of debt diplomacy that people are talking about when they are
yes,
critical of China's, especially in the context of the Sri Lankan port, Hambantota, what has happened. Some
yeah,
people are arguing that maybe this South-South colonization, this Chinese colonization
of course.
of can be just as bad, if not worse, than European.
Well, in terms of Sri Lanka, I have a student who is doing. She's Chinese, and she's actually not from China. Chinese here, and she's been doing work on that. Right, on actually the dissertation will really be more U.S. China tech competition. You know how we deal with that. But one of the things that she pointed out, and I went to investigate a little more, was that the whole question of what happened in Sri Lanka has been distorted quite a bit to make it look as though China would have put Sri Lanka in a position of debt, right, of such great debt that they couldn't get out and so on. And that what actually happened all along was, the total agency on Sri Lanka's part. Sri Lanka knew what it was getting into. Sri Lanka, this and Sri Lanka proceeded um, to to um, to continue with its debt, etc. But it knew what was going to happen. So it wasn't just China sort of forcing its way into Sri Lanka. So I'm still investigating that, but I'm now hearing that it isn't quite what we thought it was. But I think the bigger concern is more what's happening in Africa, because I think the Africans really, most countries, bought into this a lot, and there is concern about this neo-colonization, right? And neo-colonialism, meaning that China might be colonized, is colonizing you in a certain way. I think that it's naive to not to expect some of that, but I think I always put the onus on governments to know what they do. Let's say the Solomon Islands now. The Solomon Islands have said, yeah, do this. They're being very open towards China, and this is upsetting the U.S. and upsetting Australia, etc. Um, they know what they're doing, right? They have to, the governments have to be very clear, just like they have had to be with aid from the United States. You know,
But
there are some countries that have stood up for things, and some that don't. So
so that So that actually raises the question of good governance, democracy, and corruption. Are these governments always acting in the interest of the public, or they are just taking bribes from China and other countries and then basically undermining their own country,
Yes.
enrich themselves? So it's quite possible that not all countries are acting in the interest of their countries when they play ball
I
with
think
China.
governance is the thing, and that is the problem, right? And that is where I mean we can sit and we can blame colonialism and this and that, right, and so on. But at the end of the day, that's not what's responsible for bad governance.
Exactly.
And I think this is a problem. I'm sorry to say to African friends or whatever. This is a lot of the problem all over the world, right? With the all over the global South, corruption, bad governance, and so on. We're seeing certainly this continuation of, or the even a new emergence of authoritarianism, and autocracies and so on and so forth. And I think that is what dooms everything, right? So that's a problem. Yeah.
How do you see India's role in the global South? Do you see India as competing with China to become the leader of the global South, or does India
Yes.
already enjoy some kind of leadership in the global South? Do you see India
Well,
providing a model for the global South to progress?
India and China competed since the 1950s, right? For leadership of the third world as it was at that time. And there were sort of bitter, they were very unhappy with each other at the 1950, the Bandung conference and so on and so forth, right? Where everybody seemed to go to China, and Nehru, wasn't happy and so on. So they've competed for a while, but I think that India has always had this special place as the non-aligned, the leader of non-aligned, and then they moved away, right, to become more pro-US and Western and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of doubt about where India stands. I do believe, talking to Indian scholars and also people who have been in the foreign services and so on, I do believe that non-alignment is still very important to India. I do believe that being with, leading other nations, right, especially in Asia, and leading the Indian diaspora elsewhere. We in the Caribbean, for example, we do have India has taken a special interest, right? Because we have Indian diaspora, especially in Trinidad and in Guyana and in Suriname. So I do believe that they have a very strong interest. So what they're really doing is kind of balance it, right? They have a very balanced approach. What Indian friends are telling me, right, is that Modi's approach, right, the nationalism is what concerns them, because there's a lot of the Hindu nationalism isn't necessarily going to give India the soft power that we all need. These countries need soft power, and India has a certain amount of hard power, but soft power. And there seem to be concerns. I have a student, for example, who has left India because of it. Okay, and it's just a fairly bothersome thing. I know when I was in India in for a couple of years, I would visit, and in 2016, they started, with the anti-Muslim thing. I remember being there, and anytime a cow was harmed or something, immediately they would attack some Muslim person. And so you saw this developing, but I'm hearing that it's developed a lot more now, right, and so on. And so I think India will lose some of its influence if it continues along a highly nationalistic path.
So this You perhaps have heard our president repeatedly talk about the world being divided along authoritarian and democracy lines. But we see that even the so-called democracies are experiencing right-wing resurgence. I mean, we had Donald Trump as president, for God's sake, and we had Boris Johnson in UK, and now we have, Hungary and Italy just 2 weeks ago went completely
Yeah, yeah.
right. So we see the emergence of these intolerant ideologies even in so-called democracies. And we are
Right,
seeing
right.
a recession in democracy. Larry Diamond's work shows how democracy has declined
Mhm.
significantly worldwide.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
see that as hampering the decline of democracy globally as something that could hamper the North-South relations and also hamper the development of the South and its capacity to catch up with the North?
What I see will hamper the chances of the South is the division of the world between autocracies and democracies. I think I'm on record as opposing the current foreign policy of the Biden dividing the world into these two sectors, because then you ask, well, where am I? I'm not quite sure, all right. And so am I going to be tossed, like during the Cold War, right? Tossed into a category that I don't feel that I belong to. You remember during the Cold War, the communists and the anti-communists, that was it. There was a certain period of time when you didn't allow for even non-aligned, right? And the
Yes.
parties, and now to return to that and just say democracies, you're for me because you're a democracy, and and the others are not. I think it is that's what is will hamper, because I believe, as I said in maybe in that piece I did for you, I don't know, but I don't necessarily believe that we're going to have universal values. I think they're cosmopolitan values, meaning everybody, has certain values which maybe others may not accept. Right. And beyond the fundamentals, which is people should be treated properly and all, in all sorts of ways. Beyond that, there's room, right, for culture, etc. So I don't like it. For example, I don't like who would have, before I started to go to visit Saudi Arabia a bit, I thought, oh, just like everybody else, this is a country which has killed, Khashoggi and is this and is that. And then you go, and of course it's a relatively austere country, but you realize that this same person that we don't like, all right, bin Salman, is actually trying to advance the country and doing it in such a way so as not to get, the clerics too upset and the people, and the more conservative people too upset and so on and so forth. So, what do you do? All right. This is, of course, not a democracy, but at the same time, it's the kind of country in which perhaps this kind of a leader, right, would be better, would be better. So I don't like divisions like that. I think that when I think about democracy, and this is where my denominator is that you definitely should support countries which are socially, which from the human rights, right, perspective, uh, um, being, good citizens, and good citizens of the world and good citizens of their country, meaning, that they do not exploit their citizens, right? They do not put people in jail for no reason. They have they have the proper human right. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is there, right? And I think we could identify those as the countries that are good citizens one way or the other. When we start getting into some of the political nuances, it's sometimes very easy for somebody to say, oh, that's a very authoritative. I've heard people say that, you know, some of the governments in the Caribbean are too authoritarian, right? And we have a whole background in democracy. Okay. So I think that it gets to be a little bit of a nuance there, right? And so
And also
we should be
ideological,
careful.
isn't it? Part of it is
Yeah,
also ideological and geopolitical, some of these categorizations, you know. So, for example, in the current discussions, we talk about Ukraine as a savior of democracy. But if you go back and look at the indicators in 2019, Ukraine was not a democracy. It's pretty bad on the corruption issues. It was a hybrid regime, and suddenly now it's a
absolutely.
champion of democracy and freedom, right? So there is this
Exactly.
ideological
Exactly.
rhetoric, you know, completely.
Exactly. And while, of course, as a global South person, right, and as a person, as an American, um, I fully support, right? Or I should say, I certainly think that Russia's invasion was ill-advised, right? There's no question about it, and most of us do that. But at the same time, yeah, we cannot just, suddenly make this country into the most glorious, a wonderful symbol, and then try to beat up on anybody who doesn't quite, quite agree or support. I mean, how can we do that, right? Um, it is Ukraine is a particular European problem. Okay, for nations that thought they were past that stage, right, in the liberal era, and it is startling, it is shocking, in a lot of ways. But sometimes you can't help as a person looking from the South. You're saying, but wait a minute, how come, how come all that attention isn't paid to, to some of our countries where when 20 people die in Ukraine and 100 are dying in Ethiopia or whatever, right? And the West doesn't, doesn't pay as
I mean,
much attention. We
and
understand the geopolitics of it and this and that, but one of the projects that I'm working with, and I suggested to APSA, American Political Science Association, is narrowing this gap in perception, because I do feel that the U.S. foreign policy would be better designed if it understood a bit more where these countries were coming from. Okay, and these countries, of course, have to recognize where the U.S. is coming from. So you're narrowing the gap in perception, meaning trying to understand how each of these countries, arrive at their thinking. So if they didn't vote for the resolution, the Security Council resolution, or the General Assembly resolution on Ukraine, you got to understand, not just, you can't just say, oh, they are terrible and maybe they're undemocratic or there's some. You've got to get to the motivations, and the motivations can be very complex. This is where the local comes in. You've got to understand the local environment, the history of each. To me, there is just absolutely no replacement for that kind of deep, right, understanding of these countries. You may not want to do that for every country. I mean, maybe you don't care what St. Vincent or some little, countries thinking, but the main countries, right, in the global South, you need to figure out why, right, they think that way. And as you know, I know that anti-hegemonic and and so on
yeah.
comes so much into it, so much into it.
Also
Okay,
the continuation of the anti-colonial, anti-imperial sentiment, which
absolutely.
goes into, now
Yes.
in the top five economies of the world,
Mhm,
we have
mhm,
three Asian countries. We have
mhm,
China and Japan and India. And
mhm.
these three countries are also present three different models potentially for countries of the global South to emulate. The way I
Mhm.
see it is that you have China, a powerful economy which is quite hostile to the Western world, and then you
Yes.
have Japan, a powerhouse economy which is considers itself as part of the West in many ways, and then you have and it is a democracy, and then you have
Mhm.
India, which is a democracy and a rising economy, which
Mhm.
is not able to make up its mind whether it is part of the West or not.
Right,
So,
right.
which country would probably be a better model for most of the global South countries, in your view?
I think we modeled we looked at Japan a lot, right, in the 80s, right, and so on. I myself have a relationship with Japan in the sense that I've spent time there. My husband is an Asian Japan scholar, etc. And my daughter-in-law is Japanese, right? So I do think I admire Japan, right? And I admire Japan for being Western, adopting the Western thing without completely losing, right? Its cultural identity, etc. But we looked at Japan, and Japan and also the newly industrializing, the NICs at the time, Taiwan, Hong Kong, with all, because Japan, remember the flying goose model of development with Japan at
Sure.
the top and everybody following. And that turned out really to be kind of unfeasible because first it was heavily dependent on exports, for example, right? And how much could the world take of everybody, trying to export as many cars and toys and whatever as possible. And of course, it was also a very guided model, bureaucrat, or the state guided the Sogoshosha, the Mitsui Busans and the this and that at one point guided them into where they should, be going, etc. So I think it was a kind of not a model that one could really follow exactly the way it is. There was excitement about just-in-time production and all kinds of things. Yeah, I don't think that most countries were in a position to do that. I think that I think a lot of people turned by the 1990, when China started to liberalize, turned to China to look at that model. And I think the Chinese model, because it focused a little bit more on agriculture and on self-sufficiency, on this and that. I think that people could follow that. But then again, today, nobody could quite emulate China in the sense of a very powerful political system, keeping the economics in check and et cetera, et cetera. So you can't really follow that. So it might be India, all right, that you could.
So by default, you're saying India will be the one.
Yes.
I think India has two or three things going for it. One is the fact that in spite of the domestic challenges that you have identified of Hindu nationalism, creating a divide between Muslims and Hindus, which could become a fault line for India and impede its progress further. India is democratic and it's
Yes.
creative. And also,
Yes.
India is English speaking in some ways, which means it is able to connect with the Western world as
Yes.
well as with the colonial world, the post-colonial
Yes.
societies.
Yes.
So we can go and talk to
Yes.
nearly everybody in Africa and
Right.
the Caribbean, not so much in
Yeah.
Latin America, but most of the Caribbean, Africa, and a
Absolutely.
lot of
Yeah.
Asia. Yes. So there is that
Right.
ability to have people-to-people relations
Yes.
and India doesn't threaten many countries from a
Right.
security perspective the way China does, really.
Yeah, I think India is trying that very hard, even in Latin America. Because I've seen some data. Jorge Heine, my Chilean colleague, was ambassador to India and to China, and put out some stuff on that. And I think there is it's not as strong, obviously, as in places where there is a diaspora, but I think that they're trying to move forward. The question is the capacity. I don't know, given some of the difficulties in India, the economy, right, needs a lot of there's a lot of investment that has to be done within India. There's a lot of poverty that needs to be controlled, right, within India, etc. And there's a certain chaotic, right, sort of a chaotic element in terms of how India approaches even its investment and so on. But I certainly think that, and I'm not sure that one could look at the Indian model wholesale and put it somewhere else in a small small country or something. But I certainly think that India has a lot to offer in terms of South-South cooperation, South-South collaboration. It shouldn't just be saying, okay, I'm competing. It should be doing it, for itself without competing with China. But we saw in the vaccine diplomacy,
Yes.
a lot of the competition that happened a lot in the Caribbean, right? Where
Yeah.
India, was the one who was putting out a lot of propaganda to, all right, about the fact that it was delivering vaccines, right? So it was delivering vaccines at the time of scarce vaccines from the West. You couldn't get Pfizer, and so they delivered it, and then China came on board, and so there's that, obviously, that kind of competition going on, and I think it's fine. Let them compete, right? As long as other countries benefit in some way, good. So it might be India, or it might be. I mean, every country has to choose its own indigenous way. And if they want to go with the West, let's not forget, right? The European way, the Western way. To be honest, I think that everybody in the one thing we can sort of depend on is capitalism. I think in the global South,
Yeah.
right, that's the value. I mean, can you really think of places where people are not in some way, right, invested in the capitalist way of life? It's becoming very rare. Okay, so to succeed, in this international world, right, the world the way it is now, it's going to be that. And you may not even be democratic, but you're capitalist, or you may be democratic and capitalist, or you may be capitalist but wanting to be socialist in the sense of putting the money more towards basic needs, or you may be, but the defining line to me seems to be capitalism. Everybody wants to be capitalist in some way.
Professor Braveboy-Wagner, it was a pleasure talking to you, and I'm absolutely delighted that you agreed to do this interview with you. Consider this as the beginning of a conversation, not just the end of the interview. We should talk about more issues going further. For those of you who have been watching, please, if you have not already subscribed to Khanversations, please subscribe to it, like the video, and do share this video with your students, with your friends, and with your colleagues. And to those of you in Chicago who are watching, I want to let you know that I'm coming to Chicago this weekend. So on October 22nd, on Sunday, I will be giving the Sir Syed Ahmed lecture to the Aligarh Muslim University's alumni in Chicago. So hopefully I will see some of you there. And Professor Braveboy-Wagner, thank you very much.
You're welcome. It has been a pleasure.